Welcome to Order Militaris Radio TV, and we're lifelong Catholics, and we'll do is all for free, and for our love of Jesus Christ, and for our Holy Mother, the Church. We'll defend our Holy Mother, the Church. Again, this is going to be me for a little while until brother gets over severe chest cold and prayers for his quick recovery. We're going to take up where we left off with our series we began on who is Vladimir Putin really, and where we discovered his real mama was a Georgian. It was thanks to this book by Masha Geeson. Man Without a Face, The Unlikely Rise of Vladimir Putin. That was some folks in the comment section from Rome and other places have to repeatedly tell me what Masha is into with the liberal LGBTQ nonsense. I do know. What she even states in this book, in her introduction, she wasn't always like that. She wanted to settle down, have a normal, traditional family. But the things that transpired in Russia, her being robbed and mugged and assaulted numerous times by the thugs on the streets, and then only her best friend being assassinated in her apartment. It's like anything with most of these people who turn to, unnatural, ungodly things because of some sort of trauma. It's true. As the old saying goes, hate to sin, but not the sinner. Masha, she was one heck of a journalist in Russia. When she began doing this book on Vladimir Putin, when things really got tough, when her friend got assassinated, she had to leave to go become a U.S. citizen so she can tell the truth about this evil, evil man. So let's begin. Imagine you have a country and no one to run it. This was the predicament that Boris Yeltsin and his inner circle thought they faced in 1999. Yeltsin had been very ill for a long time. He had suffered several heart attacks and had undergone open heart surgery soon after he was elected for a second term in 1996. Most people believed he drank heavily, a common and easily recognizable Russian affliction, though some of those close to him insisted that Yeltsin's occasional bouts of disorientation and withdrawal stemmed from the persistent physical ailments and not from drinking. Whatever the reason, Yeltsin had become incoherent or gone missing during several state visits, devastating his supporters and disappointing his voters. By 1999, Yeltsin and his popularity rating dipping into single digits was not half the politician he had been. He still used many of the tools that had once made him great, making unexpected political appointments, altering periods of hand-on and laissez-faire governance, strategically applying his larger-than-life persona. But by now, his resembled a boxer gone blind, flailing in the ring, striking imaginary targets, and missing real ones. The more erratic the president became, the more enemies he made, and the more his enemies banded together. A year before his second and final term was to expire, Yeltsin found himself at the top of a very fragile pyramid. His many reshufflings had forced out several political generations worth of professionals. Many ministry and federal agencies' heads were now young medi- uh, mediocrities. He had been sucked into the vacuum at the top. Yeltsin's trusted allies were now so few and cloistered that the press called them the family. They included Yeltsin's daughter, Tatiana, his chief of staff, Alexander Volshin, his former chief of staff, Valentin Yushimov, whom Tatiana would later marry, another former chief of staff, an economist and architect of Russian privatization, Anatoly Chubas, and entrepreneur Boris Borovsky. Of the half a dozen so-called oligarchs, the businessmen who had grown super rich under Yeltsin and had repaid him by orchestrating his re-election campaign, Borovsky was the only one to remain firmly by the president's side. Yeltsin had no legal right to seek a third term, nor was he well enough to try. He had every reason to fear an unfriendly successor. Yeltsin was not just an unpopular president. He was the first politician whom Russians had ever trusted. And the disappointment his people felt now was every bit as bitter as the support he had once enjoyed had been inspiring. So, as we see, we're seeing players being put in place to help Boris select a new man. And some people think that the war would end if Vladimir Putin was resigned or other ideas, I I don't believe it will end. The same people who put Putin in the power will choose another man just or woman just like him, another sociopath. It could be worse than Putin, or it could be the same. Only way it ends is a deliberate military victory. The breaking up of Russia to where Russia is not one country as it was under the Tsars or Vladimir Putin, but each had its own little state and its own little governor or leader, where everyone had where everything was better. let's see how things began when Boris Yeltsin was selected. The country was battered, traumatized, and disappointed. It had experienced hope and unity in the late 1980s, culminating in August 1991, when the people beat back the junta that had threatened Gorbachev's rule. It had placed its faith in Boris Yeltsin, the only Russian leader in history to have been freely elected. In return, the people of Russia got hyperinflation that swallowed up their life savings in a matter of months. Bureaucrats and entrepreneurs who stole the state from one another in plain sight, economic and social inequality on a scale they had never known. Worst of all, many and possibly most Russians lost any sense of certainty in the future, and with it, the sense of unity that had carried them through the 1980s and early 1990s. Yeltsin's government had made the grave mistake of not addressing the country's pain and fear. Throughout the decade, Yeltsin, who had been a true populist, riding the buses and mounting the tanks, whichever the situation happened to require, increasingly withdrew into an impenetrable and heavily guarded world of black limousines and closed conferences. His first prime minister, the brilliant young economist Igor Gadar, came to epitomize post-Soviet economic reform, made it plain in the public that he considered the people too dumb to engage in any discussion about reform. The people of Russia, essentially abandoned by their leaders in their hour of pain, sought solace in nostalgia, not so much in communist ideology, which had used up its inspirational potential decades earlier, but its longing to regain Russia's superpower status. By 1999, there was palpable aggression in the air. This was a large part of the reason Yeltsin and the family were rightly terrified. The media were flourishing in an uncannily short period of time. Russians had taught themselves to make sophisticated, beautiful television and had also created an ordinate number of print outlets and several budding electronic publications. Many, though certainly not all of the country's infrastructure problems had been addressed. Intercity trains were once again running on time. The postal service was working. The number of households with a telephone and landlines was growing. One Russian company, a cellular service provider, founded in 1992, had placed its stock on the New York Stock Exchange and done very well. Yet the government seemed entirely incapable of convincing the people that things were indeed better than they had been a couple of years earlier, and certainly better than a decade earlier. The sense of uncertainty Russians had felt ever since the Soviet Union crumbled under their feet was so great that any losses seemed to confirm their expectations of doom, while any gains were transformed into fears of further loss. Yeltsin had only his populist ways to fall back on. He could not challenge or reshape expectations. He could not lead the country in finding new ideals and a new rhetoric. He could only try to give the people what they wanted. Whoever came to lead the country after Yeltsin could win easy popularity by prosecuting him. What the ailing president feared most was that a political party called Oshtoveshvo, Viva Vishya Rossiya, Fatherland, All Russia, the name, a hybrid of two political titles, sounds as elegant in Russian as it does in English. Headed by a former prime minister and several mayors and governors who had come to power and exact revenge on Yeltsin and the family, that he would spend his final days in jail. That is where Vladimir Putin came in. Borovsky tells it The family was casting about for a successor. Incongruities of scale haunt the story. A tiny group of people, besieged and isolated, were looking for someone to take over the world's largest landmass. With all its nuclear warheads and all its tragic history, the only thing smaller than the pool of candidates seemed to have been the list of qualifications required of them. Anyone with real political capital ambition, anyone with personality commensurate with the office, had already abandoned Yeltsin. The candidates were all plain men in gray suits. Brodsky claims that Putin was his protege, as he told it to me at a villa outside of London. I kept my promise to forget its specific location as soon as returned to the city. Brodsky had met Putin in 1990 when he was looking to expand his business to Leningrad. Brodsky was an academic turned car dealer. His business was selling the Lada, name Russian slapped on a car shoddy made on the basis of a long outdated Fiat. He was also importing used European cars and building service stations to fix what he sold. When Putin moved to Moscow in 1996 to take an administrative job at the Kremlin, the two began to see each other more frequently. An exclusive club Brodsky maintained in the center of the city. Brodsky had used his connections to arrange for no entry traffic signs to be placed on both ends of the city block, essentially marking a segment of the residential street as his own. Residents of several apartment buildings across the street could no longer legally drive up to their homes. But by early 1999, Brodsky was a man under siege, like the rest of the family, but more so. He was the only one of them who valued his place in Moscow society. Locked and desperate and apparently losing power struggle with former Prime Minister Yevgeny Primakov, who led the anti-Yeltsin political alliance. Brodsky had become something of a pariah. It was my wife's Lena's birthday, he told me, and we decided not to invite a lot of people because we didn't want anyone to have a strain the relationship with Primakov. So it was just friends, and then my security tells me Boris Ambrovich Vladimir Varavich Putin will be arriving in 10 minutes. And I said, what happened? And he said, he wants to wish Lena a happy birthday. And he showed up 10 minutes later with a bouquet of flowers. And I said, Volodaya, what are you doing this for? You have enough problems as it is. Are you just making a show of it? And he says, I am making a show of it, yes. And this was how he cemented the relationship, starting with the fact that he would not accept the bribe, then refusing to abandon Sobchak, and then his incident, which made me sure that he was a good, direct man, a KGB man, yes, but still a man, and went straight to Brodsky's head. What a tongue twisters. Woo. Like all of them, he was very intelligent, well educated, and rich lover. Like most of them, he was Jewish, which had marked him as an outsider from the time he was a small child. Like all of them, he had outsized ambition and boundless energy. He was a mathematics PhD who started in business with a car export and service company, but leveraging credit against hyperinflation. He had essentially swindled Russia's largest car maker out of millions of dollars. In the early and middle 1990s, he got into banking, continued to keep a hand in the car business, acquired part of a large oil company, and most important, placed himself at the helm of Russian public television or Channel 1. the country's most watched television channel, which gave him unfettered access to 98% of Russia's household. Like other oligarchs, Borovsky invested in Yeltsin's 1996 election campaign. Unlike the rest of them, he parlayed his access into a series of political appointments. He shuttled around the country, brokering political deals, negotiating for peace in Chechnya, and reveling in the spotlight. He cultivated the image of a kingmaker, certainly exaggerating his influence, and just as certainly believing half of what he said or implied as he said or implied it. Constitute generations of foreign correspondents in Russia to believe that Borovsky was the country's shadow ruler. With that, we are done with part 1 of chapter 1, The Accidental President. And next, and tomorrow, maybe, unless Brother Alexis wants to is able to return, we'll take out the rest of part 1 on how Boris Yeltsin with Borovsky and others chose Vladimir Putin. And please get this book. It's linked in all of our show pages on this topic. So please go get this book. You'll learn a lot from it. And it's good to learn about our enemies. Know how they think and how things are made over where you don't really know what the heck's going on in Russia. So get this book. It's really good. And like I'm doing with most of the books, I'm just giving you bits and pieces so that when you go get the book, you can read it for yourself in full detail. And yeah, this is Order Military Studio TV signing off. Deus Volt.